Fort Prescott, Arizona Territory, June 1886. In the stifling courtroom where justice bent like desert heat, a widow stood before a judge who held her fate in his weathered hands. The afternoon sun slanted through dusty windows, casting long shadows across wooden benches where 28 men sat watching, waiting their eyes, measuring her like livestock at auction. Ayanna Delgado, 26 years old, stood with her back straight despite the trembling in her legs. 6 months had passed since they buried Diego, her husband, in the hard red earth behind their ranch. 6 months of struggle, of debt collectors circling like vultures, of nights spent wondering how a simple rancher's wife had become prey in a game she didn't understand. Her copper skin glistened with sweat beneath the simple black dress she wore, the only formal garment she owned. Her long black hair, traditionally braided in the Apache way her mother had taught her, hung heavy against her neck. She could feel the weight of judgment from every man in that room, could sense their calculations about what she was worth, what they might gain. Judge Cornelius Harding sat elevated behind his oak desk, his steel-gray beard framing a face that revealed nothing. At 62, he had presided over this territory long enough to see fortunes made and lost lives destroyed and occasionally saved. His gavel rested beside his right hand like a weapon awaiting deployment. The judge's voice cut through the oppressive silence like a blade through silk. "Mrs. Delgado, the law is clear on this matter. A woman cannot maintain ownership of property when substantial debts are owed, and no male head of household exists to assume responsibility. You have 30 days to find a husband, or I can offer you an immediate solution. You may select a husband from among the eligible men present in this courtroom today." The words landed like stones thrown into still water, rippling outward through the assembled crowd. Murmurs began low and hungry as men leaned toward each other, whispering calculations and possibilities. Ayanna's hands gripped the worn shawl at her shoulders, knuckles pale beneath bronze skin. The 80 acres Diego had worked so hard to build, the small ranch house he had constructed with his own hands, the precious water source that made the land valuable in this arid country, all of it hung in the balance of this impossible choice. She knew some of these men. Marcus Boone, the general store owner, sat in the third row, his bulk straining against his vest eyes, bright with commercial interest. Wesley Tate, barely 24, a hunter with more ambition than sense, kept catching her eye and nodding as if they shared some understanding. And there in the front row sat a man who made her skin crawl without him saying a single word. Garrett Price, Jr., son of Morgan Blackwell, the most powerful man in 3 territories. She had heard the whispers about the Blackwell family, about their saloon empire, about the way they acquired properties from desperate widows and struggling farmers, about the way people who crossed them tended to disappear or meet with unfortunate accidents. But it was another man who caught her attention, drew her gaze like a compass finding north. He sat in the back corner, separated from the others by choice or circumstance. Tall, even while seated, he wore leather breeches and a worn jacket that spoke of hard travel and harder living. His wide-brimmed hat sat low over his eyes, shadowing a face marked by sun and experience. A thick beard, reddish-brown and untamed, covered the lower half of his face. His shoulders were broad, the kind of breadth that came from splitting wood and hauling timber, from surviving in places where weakness meant death. A Winchester rifle leaned against the wall beside him, well-maintained despite its age. His hands rested calmly on his knees, large hands with scars across the knuckles, hands that had worked and fought and built things that lasted. Unlike every other man in that room, he wasn't staring at her. He wasn't participating in the whispered speculations or the barely concealed excitement. He seemed almost removed from the proceedings, as if he had wandered into the wrong place at the wrong time and was simply waiting for permission to leave. Something about that stillness called to her. In a room full of hungry wolves here sat something different. Maybe a bear, dangerous in its own right, but not hunting, not circling, just existing in its own space with a quiet confidence that needed nothing from anyone. Judge Harding's voice brought her back to the moment. "You have 5 minutes to make your selection, Mrs. Delgado. Choose wisely. This decision will determine the course of the rest of your life. Her mind raced through possibilities. Marcus Boone would absorb her property into his commercial holdings, reducing her to an unpaid servant in her own home. Wesley Tate would work the land into dust, chasing dreams of quick wealth, and she would be left with nothing when he inevitably failed. And Garrett Price Jr., she knew instinctively, would be signing her death warrant along with the marriage certificate. The stranger in the corner shifted slightly, and she saw the edge of something metallic at his belt. Not just a gun, which every man here carried. Something else. A badge, perhaps, or had been once tucked away but not quite hidden. 4 minutes remaining. She thought of Diego, of the secrets he had kept, of the nights he would disappear with vague explanations about business in other towns, of the way he had tensed whenever Morgan Blackwell's name was mentioned, of the locked box he kept hidden in the root cellar, the one she wasn't supposed to know about, but had found anyway during one of her endless searches for anything that might explain why they were drowning in debt when the ranch should have been profitable. 3 minutes. The stranger's hands were completely still, no fidgeting, no nervous energy, the kind of stillness that came from hunting in mountain forests, from tracking prey over days, from knowing that patience was often the difference between life and death. She recognized it because her Apache mother had taught her the same lessons, different terrain, but the same fundamental truth. 2 minutes. Mrs. Delgado, the judge prompted, his tone carrying a note of warning. She made her decision in the space between heartbeats, trusting instinct over reason, choosing the unknown over the certain disaster that waited among the familiar faces. Her voice, when it came, was stronger than she felt. "I choose that man." She pointed directly at the stranger in the corner. "The one with the rifle." The reaction was immediate and explosive. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Marcus Boone's face purpled with indignation. Wesley Tate looked genuinely shocked, mouth hanging open. Garrett Price Jr.'s expression darkened into something cold and calculating, eyes narrowing as he studied the man Ayanna had selected. The stranger himself looked up slowly as if waking from a reverie. When his hat brim lifted, she saw eyes the color of storm clouds, gray and deep, and utterly unreadable. He studied her face for a long moment, and she felt the weight of that assessment, felt him seeing past the surface to something underneath. Judge Harding cleared his throat, clearly taken aback by this unexpected development. "Mr. McAllister, are you willing to accept this arrangement?" So, he had a name. McAllister. It sounded like mountains and cold streams, like places where the air was thin and clear. The man stood slowly unfolding to his full height, easily 6 feet 2 inches, maybe more. Even in the confined space of the courtroom, he seemed to carry with him the vastness of open country. His voice, when he spoke, was like whiskey over gravel, low and rough around the edges shaped by wind and altitude. "Ma'am," he addressed her directly, ignoring everyone else in the room. "You certain about this? I'm not from around here. Don't plan to stay forever." The honesty in the question struck her. Every other man in this room would have leaped at the opportunity without question, would have seen only the land, the water, the commercial value. This stranger was giving her a chance to reconsider, was acknowledging that she might be making a mistake. "I'm certain," she replied, and was surprised to find it was true. Something shifted in his expression, too subtle to name, but present nonetheless. He nodded once, a sharp, decisive movement. "Then I accept." The words hung in the air like the last note of a bell, resonating with finality. Judge Harding shuffled papers, his movements methodical, revealing nothing of whatever thoughts moved behind those calculating eyes. "Very well. Mr. McAllister, do you understand that by accepting this arrangement, you are assuming responsibility for all debts associated with Mrs. Delgado's property?" "I understand." "And Mrs. Delgado, you understand that this marriage will be legally binding and cannot be easily dissolved?" "I understand." Though she wondered if anyone truly understood what they were agreeing to in moments like these, when desperation and hope twisted together into something that resembled choice. The judge leaned forward, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. "Then, by the power vested in me by the territory of Arizona, I pronounce you husband and wife. Mr. McAllister, You may kiss your bride." The words created a pocket of expectant silence. Ayanna felt heat rise to her face, suddenly aware that she was about to be kissed by a man whose full name she had learned only minutes ago. But Ezra McAllister made no move toward her. Instead, he touched the brim of his hat in a gesture that was somehow more intimate than any kiss could have been, a sign of respect that acknowledged her as an equal rather than a possession newly acquired. "Mrs. McAllister," he said quietly, and the sound of her new name on his lips sent an unexpected shiver down her spine. The courtroom erupted in conversation as men began filing out, some shaking their heads in bewilderment, others casting speculative glances at the unlikely couple. But Garrett Price Jr. remained seated for a moment, his cold gaze fixed on them with an intensity that felt like a physical threat. He rose, finally moving with the controlled grace of a predator, and intercepted them at the courtroom door. Up close, he smelled of expensive cologne and tobacco, of money and barely concealed violence. "Mrs. McAllister," he said, his tone dripping with false courtesy, "I trust you understand that the debts on your property remain substantial. $580 is not an insignificant sum. My father's bank has been very patient, but patience has its limits." Ezra stepped slightly forward, not aggressively but definitively placing himself between Ayanna and Price. The movement was subtle, economical, but it changed the entire dynamic. She felt rather than saw the shift in his posture, like watching a mountain cat tense before a strike. "Mr. Price." His voice carried quiet authority that seemed to fill the space around them. "I appreciate your concern, but I believe my wife and I can handle our own affairs." The word wife, spoken so naturally, created a strange flutter in Ayanna's chest. They had been married for less than 5 minutes, yet he claimed the relationship with a certainty that felt almost protective. Price's smile faltered slightly, and she saw calculation move behind his eyes. "Of course. I simply want to ensure everyone understands the gravity of the situation. The bank has been very accommodating, but accommodation has a cost." "How much?" Ezra's question was blunt, cutting through the social niceties like a knife through cloth. Price blinked clearly, not expecting such directness. "I beg your pardon. How much is owed, total amount, including interest and whatever fees you've added?" A flush crept up Price's neck. He wasn't accustomed to being challenged, especially not by drifters in worn leather jackets. "Perhaps we should discuss this privately at a more appropriate time." "Now seems appropriate to me." Ezra's tone suggested he wasn't accustomed to having his requests denied. The silence stretched between them, taut as a bowstring. Finally, Price pulled a leather portfolio from inside his jacket, flipping through papers with barely concealed irritation. "The total amount, including accumulated interest and legal fees, comes to $580. The sum hung in the air like a death sentence. Ayanna felt her knees go weak. $580 was more money than most ranchers saw in 2 years. It was an impossible amount, a debt that would take decades to repay, even under the best circumstances. But Ezra McAllister simply nodded, as if Price had quoted the price of a cup of coffee. "I'll have the money for you by Friday." The silence that followed was so complete that Ayanna could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. Even Judge Harding, who had been preparing to leave, stopped and turned to stare. Price's face had gone pale, his mouth opening and closing several times before he managed to speak. "Mr. McAllister, I don't think you understand the magnitude of what you're saying. $580 is not a sum that can be easily obtained." "Friday," Ezra repeated, and there was a finality in his voice that broke no argument. Price looked as though he wanted to say more, but something in Ezra's steady gaze seemed to discourage further discussion. He nodded curtly, tucked his portfolio back into his jacket, and pushed past them toward the door, muttering under his breath about fools and their money. Ayanna stared at her new husband in amazement. "Ezra," she began, then stopped, realizing she didn't even know what to call him. They were married now, but they were still strangers. "You can call me Bear," he said, as if reading her thoughts. "Most folks do. And before you ask, yes, I can cover the debt. but we should discuss the details somewhere more private." He offered her his arm with old-fashioned courtesy, and Ayanna found herself accepting it, marveling at the solid strength she felt beneath the worn leather of his jacket. Together they walked out of the courthouse and into the scorching Arizona afternoon. The sun hung heavy and white in a sky bleached of color, turning Fort Prescott's dusty streets into a furnace. A wagon waited nearby, hitched to two sturdy horses that stood patiently despite the heat. Ezra helped her up onto the seat with surprising gentleness for a man his size, then climbed up beside her and took the reins. "Which way to your ranch?" he asked, his voice carrying easily despite not being raised. Ayanna pointed east toward the rolling hills that stretched away from town. "About 3 miles. But Ezra Bear, we need to talk about what just happened. I can't let you pay that debt without understanding what you're getting yourself into." He urged the horses forward, guiding them through the streets with practiced ease. They passed the general store where Marcus Boone stood in the doorway, watching their departure with undisguised resentment. They passed the saloon, a large establishment that dominated the center of town, and Ayanna caught a glimpse of Morgan Blackwell himself, standing at a second-story window, his silhouette dark against the light, watching them pass with an intensity that made her skin prickle. Once they were clear of town, following the rutted trail that led toward her ranch, Ezra finally spoke. "What I'm getting myself into is marriage to a woman brave enough to choose a stranger over the devil she knows. That tells me something about your character, Mrs. McAllister." The sound of her full married name sent another shiver through her, but this time it wasn't entirely from cold. "You don't understand. The farm is barely profitable. The soil's been overworked. The equipment's old. I've been struggling just to keep food on the table. Even if you pay off the debt, you'll be tied to a failing enterprise." Ezra was quiet for a long moment, concentrating on guiding the horses through increasingly treacherous terrain. When he finally spoke, his words were almost lost in the sound of hooves and creaking wagon wheels. "Maybe the farm's not the only thing that needs a fresh start." She turned to study his profile, trying to understand what he meant. But before she could ask, he continued, his voice taking on a different quality, something darker and more serious. "6 months ago, I met your husband, Diego. We were tracking a band of outlaws up near the Colorado border, near where I grew up in the Rocky Mountains. There was a grizzly, wounded and angry, came out of nowhere. Diego put himself between me and that bear, took a swipe that should have killed him, but didn't give me time to get my rifle up and end it. He saved my life." Ayanna felt her breath catch. Diego had never mentioned this encounter, had never spoken of traveling to Colorado or tracking outlaws or fighting bears. But then Diego had kept many secrets she was learning. "We spent 3 days together after that, waiting for his wounds to heal enough to travel. He talked about you, about the ranch, about how much he loved the land, loved you, but how he was involved in something dangerous, something he couldn't tell you about because he was trying to protect you." The horses picked their way carefully through a rocky stretch, and Ezra's hands on the reins were steady, confident. "On the 3rd day before we parted ways, he made me promise. He said if anything ever happened to him, if he didn't come back, I should find Ayanna Delgado and make sure she was protected. I gave him my word. I'm a man who keeps his word." Tears stung Ayanna's eyes, hot and unexpected. 6 months of holding herself together, of being strong, of not allowing herself to grieve properly, because grief was a luxury she couldn't afford when survival demanded all her attention. Now, hearing this story, understanding that Diego had thought of her even in those moments that he had tried to arrange protection for her, even from a distance, the weight of it threatened to crush her. "He never told me," she whispered. "He never said anything about Colorado or bears or you. He was protecting you. What he was involved in, the people he was dealing with, they're dangerous. The less you knew, the safer you were, or so he thought." Before Ayanna could respond, before she could ask what he meant by that cryptic statement, the sound of hoofbeats reached them from behind. Multiple horses moving fast, closing the distance with purposeful speed. Ezra's hands tightened on the reins, and she saw his entire body tense in a way that suggested he was no stranger to danger. "How many enemies do you have, Mrs. McAllister?" The question sent a chill through her despite the desert heat. "I don't know." "I don't understand any of this." The riders were close enough now that she could make out details. 6 men heavily armed, their faces hard with violent intent. The leader raised his hand, and even from a distance Ayanna could see the unmistakable glint of drawn weapons. "Hold on," Ezra said, his voice tight with concentration. He yanked hard on the reins, pulling the horses sharply to the left, just as the first gunshot cracked through the afternoon air like a branch snapping under winter's weight. The bullet screamed past Ayanna's ears so close she felt the displaced air hot and violent against her skin. The sound of the gunshot echoed across the desert hills, sending a pair of hawks spiraling upward from their perch on a dead saguaro. Ezra urged the horses into a desperate gallop, the wagon lurching over the uneven ground with bone-jarring force. Ayanna gripped the seat with both hands, her knuckles white, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The familiar landscape of her home territory had transformed into a gauntlet of stone and scrub brush, every rock and gully a potential death trap at this speed. Behind them, the 6 riders spread out in a practiced formation, the kind of coordinated movement that spoke of military training or long experience hunting human prey. Their horses were fresh, well-fed, built for speed. The wagon horses, steady and reliable for farm work, were already beginning to labor under the strain. Another shot rang out, this one splintering the wooden side of the wagon just inches from where Ayanna sat. She pressed herself lower, feeling the solid warmth of Ezra beside her, his body a barrier between her and the hunters who wanted them dead. "Who are they?" she shouted over the thunder of hooves and the creaking protest of the wagon. "Don't know," Ezra called back, his attention focused on the treacherous path ahead. "But they're not amateurs. That's professional pursuit." The trail they followed wound through a landscape of red rock and sparse vegetation, the kind of country that could hide an army or kill a traveler who didn't know its secrets. Ahead, Ayanna could see the dark line of cottonwoods that marked Blackwater Creek, normally a modest stream, but swollen now from recent rains in the mountains. "There," she pointed. "The creek. We can lose them in the trees." Ezra nodded, steering the horses toward the water. The wagon plunged down the embankment in a controlled fall, wheels sliding in loose dirt and gravel. For one heart-stopping moment, Ayanna thought they would overturn completely, would spill out onto the rocks and be easy prey for the men behind them. But Ezra's hands on the reins were sure, his body moving with the wagon's momentum rather than fighting it, and they reached the creek bottom upright, if not entirely intact. The horses splashed into the water, which ran deeper and faster than Ayanna remembered. The current pulled at the wagon wheels, threatening to sweep them downstream toward rocks and fallen trees that could smash the wagon to kindling. Behind them, their pursuers reached the top of the embankment. The leader, a man with a face like weathered leather and eyes that held no mercy, raised his rifle. Ayanna recognized him with a jolt of terror. Jack Drummond, called Rattlesnake by those who knew his reputation, a bounty hunter and killer who worked for whoever paid the highest price. "That's Drummond," she gasped. "He works for Morgan Blackwell." Ezra's jaw tightened beneath his beard, but he said nothing, concentrating instead on keeping the horses moving through the treacherous water. The current was stronger than it looked, pulling with the insistent force of something alive and hungry. Drummond's rifle barked the shot, sending up a geyser of water 3 feet to their left. Too close, much too close. Then they were among the cottonwoods, the ancient trees providing cover as Ezra guided the wagon up the far bank. Branches whipped at their faces, leaves and twigs showering down around them. The horses lunged up the slope, foam flecking their mouths, muscles straining with effort. Behind them, Drummond and his men hesitated at the water's edge. Ayanna could hear them shouting to each other, debating whether to risk the crossing or find another way around. The delay bought precious seconds, maybe a minute. Ezra used that minute well. Once they cleared the tree line, he turned the wagon sharply north, following a narrow path that Ayanna recognized as the old hunting trail her father had used years ago. It wound through rough country terrain that would slow the horses but provide countless places to hide or make a stand. After what felt like hours but was probably only 15 minutes, Ezra pulled the horses to a halt in a small box canyon, 3 walls of red rock rising around them like the walls of a fortress. He jumped down from the wagon, moving with surprising speed for a man his size, and began unhitching the horses. "We leave the wagon," he said, his voice calm despite the situation. "Too easy to track, too slow in this terrain. We take the horses, ride hard for your ranch. You know another way besides the main trail." Ayanna's mind raced, sorting through memories of this landscape she had known since childhood. "Yes, through the high country. It's rougher, takes longer, but they won't expect it." "Good." He finished with the horses, then reached into the wagon bed and pulled out a leather saddlebag she hadn't noticed before. Whatever was inside was heavy, the bag settling against his hip with substantial weight. Within minutes they were mounted, Ayanna on one of the wagon horses, Ezra on the other. The animals were tired, but game, responding to the urgency in their riders. They set off at a steady pace through terrain that grew increasingly rugged, climbing into the foothills where juniper and pinyon pine clung to rocky soil. The sun had shifted toward afternoon, the light taking on that peculiar quality of the high desert, sharp and unforgiving. Sweat ran down Ayanna's back beneath her black dress, the fabric wholly inappropriate for this kind of riding. She found herself wishing for the deerskin riding clothes her mother had made for her years ago, clothes she hadn't worn since marrying Diego, trying to fit herself into the mold of a respectable rancher's wife. After an hour of hard riding, Ezra called a halt near a spring that bubbled up between rocks, creating a small pool of clear water. The horses drank gratefully while Ezra kept watch, his rifle across his knees, his eyes constantly scanning the terrain behind them. Ayanna dismounted, her legs shaky from tension and exhaustion. She knelt by the spring, cupping water in her hands, drinking deeply of the cold sweetness that tasted of stone and sky. "Why are they after us?" she asked when she could speak again. "Why now? Diego's been dead for 6 months. If this is about him, about whatever he was involved in, why wait?" Ezra was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant. When he spoke, his words were measured, careful. "Your husband was investigating Morgan Blackwell. Diego wasn't just a rancher, Ayanna. He was a United States Marshal working undercover to gather evidence about illegal weapons smuggling." The words hit her like a physical blow. She sat back on her heels, staring at him in disbelief. "That's not possible. Diego was a rancher. He raised cattle. He grew corn. He was just a farmer. He was a farmer who made mysterious trips that lasted weeks at a time, a farmer who kept records hidden in locked boxes, a farmer who had contacts in places no simple rancher would know." Ezra's voice was gentle but implacable. "He was also one of the best undercover operatives the Marshal Service had, and he was close to exposing Blackwell when he died." Ayanna's world tilted sideways. Every certainty she had clung to, every memory of her marriage suddenly looked different, as if she had been viewing a painting from the wrong angle and only now saw its true image. The accident. They said he fell from his horse. There was no accident. Ezra met her eyes directly, his gray gaze steady and sad. "Diego was murdered. Blackwell's men made it look like a riding accident, but it was an execution. And they did it because he was about to complete his investigation, about to send evidence that would have destroyed Blackwell's entire operation." The spring burbled cheerfully, indifferent to the terrible revelation. Somewhere nearby, a canyon wren sang its descending scale, the notes falling through the afternoon like tears. Ayanna felt something break open inside her chest, 6 months of grief and confusion suddenly crystallizing into understanding. "You're a marshal too," she said. It wasn't a question. He nodded. "Deputy Marshal. Diego and I were working the same case from different angles. I was supposed to meet him 2 days before he died, supposed to receive the evidence he'd gathered. But I arrived too late. By the time I got to the meeting place, he was already buried, and you were alone, drowning in debts that Blackwell's men had manufactured to force you off the land." "But why?" Ayanna stood pacing the small clearing like a caged animal. "Why do they care about the ranch? It's just 80 acres of marginal land." "Because Diego hid the evidence there. Somewhere on your property, There's documentation that details every weapons shipment Blackwell has smuggled across the border for the past 3 years. Lists of buyers' routes, corrupt officials who've been paid to look the other way. Everything needed to bring down not just Blackwell, but an entire network of criminals who've been profiting from Apache violence. The words settled over Ayanna like snow, cold and smothering. She thought of her ranch, the place she had called home for 4 years, and realized she had been living on top of a powder keg without knowing it. Where did he hide it? I don't know. That's what we need to find, and we need to find it before Blackwell does. Ezra stood moving to his horse, checking the saddle with practiced efficiency. That's why Drummond and his men attacked. They're not trying to kill us yet. They're following us, waiting to see where we go, what we do. Once they figure out where the evidence is hidden, then we become expendable. A sound reached them from the trail below, distant but distinct. Horses, multiple riders, moving carefully but steadily in their direction. They found our trail, Ezra said, his voice tight. We need to move. They mounted again, pushing the tired horses harder than was wise, climbing higher into terrain that grew increasingly difficult. The sun slid toward the western horizon, painting the desert in shades of amber and rust. Shadows lengthened across the land, turning familiar landmarks strange. As full darkness fell, they finally reached Ayanna's ranch. The small house sat dark and silent, a shadow against shadows. The barn loomed nearby, and beyond it, the corrals and outbuildings that made up the modest operation Diego had built. Ezra dismounted cautiously, his rifle ready, his eyes scanning for any sign of ambush. But the ranch appeared deserted, untouched, since Ayanna had left that morning for the courthouse that now felt like it belonged to another lifetime. Inside the house, Ayanna lit a single lamp, keeping the flame low. The familiar space looked different now, filled with secrets and lies. Everything she thought she knew about her life here had been an elaborate fiction, a cover story for a man playing a dangerous game with deadly stakes. The root cellar, she said, suddenly remembering. Diego spent weeks down there before he died, said he was reinforcing the walls against frost damage, but I never saw any actual repairs, and he warned me never to go down there alone, said the supports were unstable. Ezra's eyes sharpened with interest. Show me. The entrance to the root cellar was behind the house, a heavy wooden door set into the hillside at an angle. Ezra pulled it open, revealing stone steps descending into darkness. The air that rose from below was cool and musty, carrying scents of earth and preserved food, and something else, something that might have been old paper and leather. They descended carefully, Ezra going first with the lamp held high. The cellar was larger than expected, extending well beyond the modest dimensions visible from outside. Wooden shelves lined the walls, holding jars of preserved vegetables, sacks of grain, the ordinary provisions of a working ranch. But Ayanna's eyes were drawn to the far wall, where the stones looked newer than the rest, more carefully fitted. She moved toward it, running her fingers over the rough surface, feeling for irregularities. Here, she said, pressing against a stone that sat slightly proud of its neighbors. It moved under her touch, grinding against its fellows with a sound like a sigh. Ezra set the lamp on a shelf and helped her work the stone free. Behind it lay a cavity, man-made and deliberate, and within that cavity sat a leather satchel wrapped in oiled cloth to protect it from moisture. Ayanna's hands trembled as she lifted it out, the weight of it somehow heavier than its physical mass suggested. She unwrapped the oiled cloth, slowly revealing a satchel that bore Diego's initials stamped into the leather. Inside were 3 leather-bound ledgers, their pages covered with Diego's careful handwriting. Maps meticulously drawn showing routes from Mexico through Arizona Territory and into New Mexico. Lists of names, dates, amounts. Photographs faded and grainy but clear enough to identify faces. And letters, correspondence between Blackwell and various officials discussing shipments and payments and the business of death. Ezra picked up one of the ledgers, his expression growing grimmer with each page he turned. This is more comprehensive than we dared hope. He documented everything. Every Winchester rifle smuggled to Apache renegades, every payment to corrupt officials, every murder committed to protect the operation. With this evidence we can bring down not just Blackwell, but at least 15 corrupt officials throughout the territory. Ayanna sank down onto a wooden crate, the reality of it all overwhelming. Her husband, the quiet man she had shared a bed with for 4 years, had been living a double life, gathering evidence that would reshape the political landscape of the entire territory, and he had died for it, murdered by men who saw human lives as nothing more than obstacles to profit. "There's something else," Ezra said, pulling a folded paper from between the pages of one ledger. He opened it, and Ayanna recognized Diego's handwriting immediately, the careful script he used for important things. "My dearest Ayanna," Ezra read aloud, his voice gentle. "If you are reading this, then I have failed to return to you, and for that I am sorrier than words can express. I know you will be angry that I kept secrets, angry that I did not trust you with the truth. But I was trying to protect you from a world of violence and corruption that would have put you in terrible danger." He paused, and Ayanna nodded for him to continue. "I have left instructions with a woman named Martha Whitman at the Ridgeview boarding house in Fort Prescott. She will help you if you need it, and if a man named Bear comes to you, trust him. He is a good man, a man of honor who keeps his promises. Together you may be able to finish what I started. All my love, always. Diego." Tears streamed down Ayanna's face, hot and unchecked. She had been angry at Diego for so long, angry at his secrets, at his absences, at the debts that threatened to destroy everything they had built. Now, understanding the truth, the anger transformed into something else. Pride, grief, love, and a burning determination to ensure his sacrifice had not been in vain. A sound from above froze them both. Footsteps on the floor of the house, multiple people moving with the careful stealth of predators. Ezra moved instantly, blowing out the lamp and plunging them into darkness. His hand found Ayanna's arm, his grip firm but not painful, guiding her toward the back of the cellar. "Is there another way out?" He whispered, his lips close to her ear. She thought frantically, sorting through childhood memories of exploring this place. "Yes. An old mining tunnel. My father dug it looking for silver, never found any, but it connects to the abandoned mine on the back 40, about half a mile through solid rock." "Show me." They moved through the darkness. Ayanna's hands feeling along the familiar walls, finding the narrow opening she remembered barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through. The tunnel beyond was pitch black, the air close and stale. Behind them, light flickered down the cellar stairs. Voices called out, rough and commanding. "Search everything. Tear it apart if you have to. The evidence is here somewhere." Ayanna and Ezra slipped into the tunnel, pulling loose stones behind them to conceal the entrance. Then they were moving through absolute darkness, feeling their way forward, the satchel clutched against Ayanna's chest like a talisman. The tunnel seemed to go on forever, a nightmare passage through the bones of the earth. Ayanna's dress caught on rough stone tearing, but she didn't stop. Behind them, faintly, they could hear the sounds of destruction as Drummond's men systematically destroyed her home, searching for what she now carried. After an eternity that might have been 15 minutes or an hour, fresh air touched Ayanna's face. The tunnel opened into the old mine, larger and more stable than the passage they had just traversed. Moonlight filtered down through gaps in the collapsed roof, providing just enough illumination to see by. They emerged into the cool desert night, two shadows among many, carrying evidence that could change everything. In the distance toward the ranch house, they could see lights moving, hear the sounds of frustrated men finding nothing. "We can't go back," Ezra said quietly. "They'll be watching the ranch. We need to get this evidence to Martha Whitman and from there to the territorial marshal in Santa Fe. It's 60 miles through country Blackwell controls, and he'll have men watching every route." Ayanna looked up at the stars scattered across the vast darkness above them, the same stars her Apache ancestors had navigated, by the same stars that had guided travelers and wanderers since the beginning of time. She thought of Diego, of his sacrifice, of the promise she had not known she was making when she chose a stranger in a courthouse. "Then we find a way no one expects," she said. "Through Apache lands. Through territory even Blackwell's men fear to travel. Ezra studied her face in the moonlight, seeing something there that made him nod slowly. "You can get us through." "My mother's people will help, but we need to reach them first. And we need to move now before Drummond realizes we've escaped." They set off into the night, leaving behind the only home Ayanna had known as a married woman, carrying evidence that represented the last work of a man who had loved her enough to die protecting people he would never meet. The desert stretched before them, vast and ancient and unforgiving. But for the first time since Diego's death, Ayanna felt something other than despair. She felt purpose. The desert night wrapped around them like a cloak woven from shadow and starlight. Ayanna and Bear moved through terrain that would have broken a lesser person, following paths that existed more in memory than in any physical reality. The horses they had taken from the ranch picked their way carefully over stone and through patches of prickly pear cactus that glowed silver in the moonlight. Behind them, the lights at the ranch house had multiplied. More men had arrived, and Ayanna could imagine the fury on Drummond's face when he realized his quarry had slipped through his fingers. They would be searching the area soon, spreading out in all directions, hunting for any sign of passage. Bear rode slightly ahead, his body moving with the horse in a way that spoke of years in the saddle. Despite the danger, despite the exhaustion that pulled at her bones, Ayanna found herself studying him, trying to understand this man who had entered her life like a lightning strike, sudden and transformative. "You said you grew up in the Rocky Mountains," she said quietly, her voice barely carrying over the soft sound of hooves on sand. "What brought you this far south?" He was silent for so long she thought he might not answer. Then his voice came low and thoughtful, shaped by wind and altitude. "Duty, I suppose. The Marshal Service sent me where they needed someone who could track through rough country, someone who understood how to survive in places most men fear to go. And there was a promise I made to a dying man long before I met Diego, a promise about justice and protecting those who can't protect themselves." They crested a low rise, and the land opened before them, miles of emptiness stretching toward distant mountains that were barely visible against the star-filled sky. Somewhere out there lay Apache territory land that had been home to Ayanna's mother's people for generations beyond counting. "My mother was Chiricahua Apache." Ayanna said, the words coming easier now in the darkness. "She met my father when he was working as a vaquero for a ranch near the border. They married despite both families disapproving. She taught me the old ways before she died when I was 12. My grandfather, Chief Mongus, leads one of the last peaceful bands. They have an arrangement with the territorial government, a fragile peace that benefits no one if it breaks." "And the weapons Blackwell is smuggling," Bear said, understanding immediately. "They're going to Apache renegades, groups that want to fight, that refuse the peace your grandfather negotiated." "Yes. If those weapons are used in raids, the Army won't distinguish between renegades and peaceful bands. They'll come after everyone. My grandfather's people, innocent families, children, they'll all be swept up in the violence." Her voice caught on the last word, thick with emotion. Diego was trying to prevent a war. The weight of it settled over them, heavier than the satchel of evidence, heavier than the exhaustion that made every mile an effort. They were carrying more than documents and photographs. They were carrying the possibility of peace, the lives of people who had no idea their fate was being decided by strangers in the night. As dawn approached, painting the eastern sky in shades of rose and gold, they found shelter in a box canyon Bear identified through some instinct Ayanna couldn't name. A spring bubbled up from between rocks, creating a small pool surrounded by grass that looked almost obscenely green against the desert browns and reds. They dismounted, and Ayanna's legs nearly buckled beneath her. She had been riding for hours, her body pushed beyond what she thought possible. Bear caught her elbow, steadying her with that same gentle strength he had shown in the courthouse. "Rest," he said. "I'll keep watch. We're safe here for a few hours." But Ayanna shook her head. "First, we need to look at what Diego left us. We need to understand exactly what we're carrying." They sat by the spring, the morning light growing stronger around them, and spread out the contents of the satchel. The ledgers were meticulously organized, each page documenting a different aspect of Blackwell's criminal enterprise. The first ledger detailed weapons shipments, 500 Winchester rifles over 3 years purchased through corrupt Army quartermasters and smuggled across the border in wagons marked as carrying mining equipment or agricultural supplies. The second ledger was a financial record showing payments to officials throughout the territory. Sheriff's deputies, town marshals, even a territorial judge, all receiving regular bribes to look the other way or actively assist in the smuggling operation. The sums were staggering, thousands of dollars flowing through Blackwell's hands, blood money that funded a lifestyle of luxury while people died in the violence those weapons enabled. The third ledger was the most damning, a record of murders committed to protect the operation. Diego had documented 12 deaths over 3 years, including names, dates, and methods. Ranch hands who asked too many questions. A newspaper editor who had started investigating suspicious shipments. A deputy marshal who had gotten too close to the truth. Here, Bear set his finger, stopping on an entry near the end of the third ledger. Diego Delgado, May 15, 1886. Method staged riding accident. Witnesses paid off. Investigation controlled by Sheriff Myers on Blackwell's payroll. Seeing her husband's death recorded in such clinical detail, knowing that his murder had been planned and executed with the same cold efficiency as a business transaction, Ayanna felt rage kindle in her chest. Not the hot explosive anger that burned quickly and left only ash, but something colder, more enduring, the kind of anger that could sustain a person through hardship and danger. "We need to get this to Santa Fe," she said, her voice hard. "To Marshal Hayes. Diego mentions him in several places. He trusted Hayes to act on this information." Bear nodded, carefully returning the documents to the satchel. 60 miles through country Blackwell controls. He'll have men watching the main routes, the stage roads, anywhere we might reasonably travel. Our best chance is to go where he won't expect, through terrain rough enough that most people would consider it impassable. "Through Apache lands," Ayanna said. "My grandfather's territory is between here and Santa Fe. If we can reach his camp, if I can convince him to help us, his warriors can guide us through country no white man knows. But there's a risk." "What risk?" "My grandfather might not help. The Apache have been betrayed by white authorities so many times that trust is almost impossible. Even knowing I'm his granddaughter, even understanding what's at stake, he might decide his people are safer staying out of it entirely." Bear studied her face, his gray eyes thoughtful. "But you think you can convince him?" "I think I have to try." They rested through the hottest part of the day, taking turns keeping watch while the other slept. Ayanna dreamed of Diego, of the secrets he had kept, of the double life he had lived with such skill that she had never suspected. In her dreams he tried to tell her something important, his mouth moving but no sound emerging, and she woke with tears on her face and a hollow ache in her chest. By afternoon they were moving again, climbing higher into broken country where red rock formations rose like ancient monuments to forgotten gods. The horses struggled with the terrain, but they were tough animals bred for hard work, and they pushed forward with stubborn determination. As sunset approached, they encountered the first sign of Apache presence. A stone cairn marked a boundary, and beside it someone had left an arrangement of sticks that would have meant nothing to most travelers, but which Ayanna recognized as a warning sign. They were being watched. "We're in their territory now," she said quietly. "Don't reach for your weapon no matter what happens. If they wanted us dead, we'd already be dead." The warriors materialized from the landscape itself, 12 men who seemed to condense out of shadow and stone. They were Chiricahua Apache, their faces painted for war, their weapons a mixture of traditional bows and modern rifles. They moved with the absolute confidence of men on their own land, men who had never been conquered despite decades of pressure from an expanding nation. The leader was young, perhaps 25, with fierce eyes and a scar that ran from his temple to his jaw. He spoke in rapid Apache, his tone aggressive, demanding. Ayanna dismounted slowly, her hands visible and empty, and responded in the same language. The words came back to her like a song half-remembered from childhood, the patterns and rhythms her mother had taught her during long afternoons in their small house. I am Ayana, granddaughter of Chief Mangus, daughter of Morning Bird, who was his daughter. I seek passage to my grandfather's camp. I carry words that concern the safety of all our people. The young warrior's expression shifted slightly, suspicion warring with curiosity. Chief Mangus has spoken of you, the granddaughter who married a Mexican who turned her back on her people. The words stung, but Ayana kept her voice level. I married a man who fought for justice, a man who died trying to prevent a war that would destroy both our peoples. I carry proof of a plot against the Apache, against my grandfather, against every peaceful band trying to survive in this changing world. Another warrior spoke, older, his voice carrying authority. And the white man, the one with the mountain face and the guns of a killer. Bear had remained mounted, his hands resting on the saddle horn, his posture relaxed despite the tension in the air. Ayana gestured toward him. This is Bear, a man of honor who keeps his promises. My husband's friend. My husband. The last word felt strange on her tongue, this claim of a relationship that existed in law but not yet in reality. But she saw the warrior's expressions shift slightly. A husband had standing, had the right to protect his wife, had a place in the social order they understood. The older warrior studied Bear with eyes that missed nothing. Then he spoke in heavily accented English. You have killed men. It wasn't a question. Bear nodded slowly. Yes, men who needed killing. Men who preyed on the weak and innocent. But I take no joy in death. Good. Men who enjoy killing are dangerous like rabid wolves. The warrior made a decision, his hand gesture bringing the others to attention. We take you to Chief Mangus. He will decide if you speak truth or lies. If lies, you die. If truth, perhaps you live. Perhaps. They were escorted through country that grew increasingly rugged, climbing into foothills where juniper and pine provided sparse cover. The Apache moved through this terrain like water flowing downhill, utterly at home, while Ayana and Bear struggled to keep pace. As darkness fell, they reached the Apache camp, a collection of wickiups arranged in a natural amphitheater formed by red rock cliffs. Fires burned in the center, their smoke rising straight up in the still evening air. Women moved among the shelters, children played in the dust, and warriors stood guard at strategic points, watching the strangers with flat, assessing eyes. Chief Mangus emerged from the largest wickiup, and Ayana felt her breath catch. He was older than she remembered, his hair now completely white, his face a map of wrinkles that told stories of hardship and survival. But his eyes were still sharp, still capable of seeing through pretense to truth. He studied her for a long moment, and she saw the war between emotions on his face. Love for a granddaughter he had not seen in years. Disappointment that she had chosen a path away from her people. Curiosity about why she had returned. Ayana, he said finally, his voice like wind over stone. You honor us with your presence, though it comes late and in the company of a white man who wears violence like a second skin. She knelt before him, showing respect in the traditional way, and spoke in Apache. Grandfather, I come with heavy news and a request that may seem like madness, but I ask you to listen for the sake of your people and mine, for the sake of a peace that hangs by a thread ready to break. Mangus gestured for her to rise, then indicated that she and Bear should follow him into his wickiup. Inside, away from the watching eyes of the camp, he settled onto a buffalo hide and waited. Ayana told him everything, about Diego's secret work, about the weapons being smuggled to renegade bands, about Blackwell's plan that would inevitably lead to war. She showed him the ledgers, the documentation, the evidence that Diego had died gathering. As she spoke, she watched her grandfather's face shift through emotions. Anger at the betrayal, fear for his people, and finally a grim determination. When she finished, silence filled the wickiup like smoke. These weapons you speak of, Mangus said slowly. We have heard rumors of renegade bands to the south who suddenly possess many rifles. We thought perhaps they raided an army patrol, but this is worse. This is white men deliberately arming our enemies, creating violence they can then use as excuse to destroy us all. Yes, Bear spoke for the first time, his voice respectful but firm. Morgan Blackwell doesn't care about Apache or white settlers. He cares about profit. The more violence, the more fear, the more opportunities for him to buy land cheaply from people desperate to leave. He's engineering a war for money. Mongus turned his penetrating gaze on Bear. And you, mountain man, why do you involve yourself in our troubles? Because I gave my word to a good man who died fighting this evil. Because I believe in justice, even when it's hard, even when it costs everything. And because, he glanced at Ayanna, I made a promise to protect someone who matters. The old chief was silent for a long moment, his eyes moving between Ayanna and Bear, seeing something there that made him nod slowly. You wish to reach Santa Fe to give this evidence to the territorial marshal. Blackwell will have men watching all the roads. Yes, Ayanna confirmed. We need your help, grandfather. We need warriors who can guide us through country only. Apache know who can protect us from Blackwell's hunters. I know it's asking much, putting your people at risk. But if we fail, if this evidence never reaches Santa Fe, the war will come anyway. At least this way we have a chance to stop it. Mongus stood moving to the opening of the wickiup, looking out at his people going about their evening routines. Children laughing, women cooking, warriors sharpening weapons. Normal life precious because it was so fragile, so easily destroyed by forces beyond their control. My daughter's daughter, he said finally. You have been gone from us for many years. You chose the white man's world, the Mexican rancher's life. Yet you return now not for yourself, but for all of us. This takes courage. He turned back to face them. I will help. Not because I trust white man's justice, which has betrayed us too many times to count, but because you are family, and because the man you chose keeps his word. These are rare things in a world of lies. He called out, and the young warrior who had first confronted them entered. Nashota, gather 10 of our best warriors. You will escort my granddaughter and her husband to Santa Fe through the hidden ways. You will protect them with your lives. And if this white man's law fails us again, you will remember, and you will tell the story of how we tried once more for peace. Nashota's expression was skeptical, but he nodded obedience to his chief. As he left to gather the warriors, Mongus turned back to Ayanna. Go with my blessing, granddaughter, and if you survive this, come back. You have been away too long. Your mother would want you to remember where you come from. Tears stung Ayanna's eyes. Thank you, grandfather. Do not thank me yet. The road ahead is dangerous, and Apache guides cannot stop bullets. You may be riding to your death. Then we ride together, Bear said quietly, and Ayanna felt his hand find hers in the darkness, warm and solid, and surprisingly reassuring. They prepared through the night, gathering supplies, planning the route, understanding the risks. The Apache warriors treated Bear with wary respect, recognizing in him a fellow predator, dangerous but controlled. They treated Ayanna with a mixture of curiosity and acceptance. This woman who had been gone but was still family, still one of them in ways that mattered. As dawn approached, they rode out 13 riders moving through country that few white men had ever seen. Behind them, Chief Mongus watched until they disappeared into the broken landscape, an old man carrying the weight of his people's survival on shoulders that had borne too much for too long. Ahead lay 60 miles of danger, and at the end, either justice or death. Ayanna found she was no longer afraid. Whatever came, she would face it with her grandfather's blessing, Diego's memory, and a mountain man who kept his promises riding beside her. The sun rose over Apache lands, and they rode toward it, toward hope, toward the possibility that truth might actually matter in a world that often seemed to value only power and gold. The land changed as they traveled, transforming from open desert into a labyrinth of canyons and mesas that rose like monuments to ancient gods. Nashota led the way with the absolute confidence of a man who had traveled these paths since childhood, who knew every water source, every hidden trail, every place where the earth offered shelter or betrayal. Bear rode beside Ayanna, his eyes constantly scanning the terrain with the practiced wariness of someone who had survived by noticing what others missed. The Apache warriors spread out in a loose formation, some ahead, as scouts others behind, watching for pursuit, moving through the landscape like smoke barely disturbing the dust. They traveled through the heat of the day, something most white men would have considered madness. But the Apache knew how to find shade where none seemed to exist, knew which plants held water, knew how to move without exhausting themselves in temperatures that could kill the unprepared. During a brief rest in the shadow of a towering rock formation, Martha Whitman's name came up. Nashota, who had been listening to Bear and Ayanna discuss their plans, spoke in his rough English. "This white woman in Fort Prescott, the one your dead husband mentioned." "You trust her?" Bear answered before Ayanna could. "Martha Whitman is a deputy United States Marshal. She's been working undercover in Fort Prescott for 5 years, running an information network that Diego was part of. If we can reach her, she can help coordinate our arrival in Santa Fe, make sure we don't ride into a trap." Nashota spat into the dust. "Marshal, like the ones who promised my father's people food and shelter, then drove them onto reservations where children starve. Like the ones who sign treaties with one hand and steal land with the other." "Not all white men are liars," Ayanna said quietly in Apache. "Just as not all Apache are raiders. Diego died fighting for justice. Martha risks her life every day working against corrupt men who would destroy both our peoples for profit. There is honor in some places, even in a world that seems to have forgotten what honor means." Nashota studied her, his scarred face unreadable. Then he nodded slowly. "Perhaps. We will see. But if this white woman betrays us, I will kill her myself. Law or no law." As afternoon wore into evening, they approached a narrow defile in the mountains known as Apache Pass. It was the only practical route through this section of the range, a natural corridor that had seen countless travelers, traders, and warriors pass through its narrow confines over centuries. Bear pulled his horse to a halt, studying the pass with eyes that had seen too many ambush sites not to recognize another. The walls rose steep and forbidding on either side, creating a funnel where any force moving through would be exposed and vulnerable. The perfect place for hunters to become the hunted. "This feels wrong," he said quietly to Nashota, who had ridden back to join them. "If I were Blackwell's men, if I knew we had to reach Santa Fe, and knew we might try the Apache route, this is exactly where I'd wait." Nashota's expression suggested he had reached the same conclusion. "We could go around, 3 days longer through rough country, but you say time matters." "Blackwell will have reached Santa Fe by now," Bear said. "He'll be working to undermine Marshal Hayes, planting evidence of corruption, turning officials against him. Every hour we delay gives him more time to poison the well." A scout materialized from the rocks ahead, moving with the liquid silence that seemed to come naturally to the Apache. He spoke rapidly to Nashota in their language, and Ayanna translated for Bear, her voice tight with tension. "He says there are white men in the pass, at least 10, maybe more, hiding in positions on both sides, waiting." "Drummond," Bear said, his jaw tight beneath his beard. "He must have ridden hard through the night to get ahead of us to set up here, knowing we'd have to come through eventually." Nashota called the other warriors together, and they conferred in low voices, discussing options, weighing risks. Finally, the young war leader turned to Bear and Ayanna. "We fight, but we fight smart. Apache do not charge into ambush like foolish cavalry soldiers. We turn the trap against those who set it." He explained the plan with the efficiency of a man accustomed to life-or-death tactical decisions. Half the warriors would climb the canyon walls, approaching Drummond's men from above and behind. Ayanna and one of the women warriors, a fierce woman named Lozen, who had killed 3 soldiers in a raid the previous year, would ride through the pass openly appearing to be alone, drawing the ambush into revealing itself. Bear and the remaining warriors would follow at a distance, ready to provide covering fire once the trap was sprung. The warriors on the canyon walls would then attack from behind, catching Drummond's men in a crossfire with no escape. "It's risky," Bear set his eyes on Ayanna. "You'll be exposed vulnerable. If they shoot before we can react—" "They won't shoot immediately," Ayanna interrupted. "They want the evidence first, want to know where it is. They'll try to capture, not kill, at least at first." "That's a dangerous assumption. It's all we have." She met his gaze steadily. "Unless you have a better plan that doesn't add 3 days to our journey." He didn't, and she could see the frustration in his eyes, the desire to protect her warring with the tactical reality that her plan was sound. Finally he nodded. "At the first sign of trouble, you ride hard. Don't try to be a hero. Just survive long enough for us to reach you." Lozen checked her weapons with practiced efficiency, a rifle across her back, a knife at her belt, a revolver taken from a dead soldier tucked into her sash. She caught Ayanna's eye and smiled a fierce expression that held no softness. "Your grandfather says you know the old ways that your mother taught you before she died. Let us see if a woman who has lived among Mexicans and white men remembers how to fight like Apache." It was a challenge and an invitation both. Ayanna felt something stir in her chest, some part of herself that she had buried when she married Diego, when she tried to become a proper rancher's wife, setting aside the skills and knowledge her mother had passed down. They rode toward the pass. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, 2 women on tired horses, apparently alone and vulnerable. Ayanna's heart hammered against her ribs, but she kept her expression neutral, her posture relaxed, playing the role of someone who had no idea death waited in the rocks above. The pass swallowed them, walls rising on either side, shadows deep and concealing. The sound of their horses' hooves echoed strangely in the confined space, bouncing off stone, making it difficult to pinpoint other sounds. They had penetrated perhaps halfway through when a voice called out, harsh and commanding, echoing from the rocks above. "That's far enough, ladies. You can stop right there and keep your hands where we can see them." Ayanna pulled her horse to a halt, her hands clearly visible on the reins. Beside her Lozen did the same, though her eyes never stopped moving, cataloging positions, counting enemies, calculating angles of attack. Men emerged from hiding places in the rocks, rifles trained on the 2 women. Ayanna counted 8 visible, but she knew there would be more positioned to cover all angles. They moved with the coordination of professionals, men who had done this before, who knew their business. Jack Drummond descended from a perch halfway up the left wall, his boots finding purchase on stone that looked too steep to climb. Up close, he was even more intimidating than from a distance, all weathered leather and cold eyes, a man who had killed often enough that it had stopped meaning anything to him. "Well now," he said, his voice carrying a false joviality that made Ayanna's skin crawl. "Mrs. McAllister, I presume, and a genuine Apache savage for company. Blackwell's going to be real interested to hear about this particular alliance. What do you want?" Ayanna kept her voice steady, though fear churned in her gut. "You know what I want. The documents your late husband stole, the evidence he gathered while pretending to be a simple rancher. Hand it over and maybe you live. Maybe." "I don't have it." Drummond's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Now that's disappointing, because I really don't want to have to hurt you to get what I need. But I will. Oh, I absolutely will. So let's try this again. Where are the documents?" "Hidden. Somewhere you'll never find them." "Everything can be found, Mrs. McAllister. Everything. It's just a question of motivation." He gestured, and 2 of his men started forward, clearly intending to search the women and their horses. That's when Lozen moved. Her hand flashed to the revolver at her belt, drawing and firing in one smooth motion. The nearest man went down with a bullet in his chest, surprise frozen on his face. Ayanna kicked her horse hard, sending it lunging forward just as gunfire erupted from all sides. The carefully planned ambush dissolved into chaos as Apache warriors opened fire from the canyon walls, their shots precise and deadly, targeting Drummond's men who suddenly found themselves trapped in their own trap. Bear appeared from behind a rock formation, his Winchester rifle speaking with methodical accuracy. Each shot was placed with the skill of a man who had learned to shoot in country where ammunition was precious and every bullet needed to count. Drummond's men scattered, seeking cover that wasn't there, caught in a crossfire with nowhere to hide. Some tried to return fire, but they were shooting at shadows at enemies who appeared and disappeared among the rocks like ghosts. Ayanna rode low over her horse's neck, feeling bullets crack past her head, hearing the whine of ricochets off stone. Lozen stayed beside her, firing back with her rifle, now each shot carefully aimed despite the chaos. A man rose from behind a boulder directly in their path, rifle aimed at Ayanna's chest. Time seemed to slow, and she saw his finger tightening on the trigger, saw death approaching with the inexorability of sunset. Then Bear was there, having crossed impossible distance in impossible time, his body colliding with the gunman, taking him down in a tangle of limbs and violence. They fought on the ground, brutal and efficient, and when Bear rose, the other man didn't. "Keep moving!" Bear shouted, blood streaming from a cut above his eye. "Get to the far end of the pass." Ayanna and Lozen rode hard, the sound of battle echoing behind them. The Apache warriors were winning, their knowledge of the terrain and their superior tactical position overwhelming Drummond's ambush. But men were dying on both sides, and the air reeked of gunpowder and blood. They burst from the far end of the pass into open country beyond, and Ayanna pulled her horse to a halt, turning back to watch. The gunfire was sporadic now, individual shots rather than sustained volleys. The battle was ending. Nashota emerged from the pass, blood on his face but moving under his own power. Behind him came the other warriors, some wounded but alive. They brought with them 3 of Drummond's men, hands-bound faces showing the resignation of men who knew what capture meant. Bear was the last to emerge, half carrying one of the Apache warriors who had taken a bullet in the leg. His shirt was torn, his face streaked with dust and blood, but his eyes were clear-focused. "Drummond?" Ayanna asked. "Dead. Tried to fight his way out, went down with a rifle in his hands." Bear helped the wounded warrior down, and one of the others moved to provide medical attention. "We lost 2 men, 3 more wounded but able to ride." The cost of their passage written in blood and death. Ayanna felt the weight of it, knew that those Apache warriors had died protecting her, protecting evidence gathered by a husband she was still learning to know even in death. Nashota approached, his expression grim. "We cannot stay here. More white men will come, drawn by the sound of guns. And the wounded need care we cannot provide in open country." "How far to Fort Prescott?" Bear asked. "If we ride through the night, avoiding the main trails, we can reach the outskirts by dawn." Nashota looked at the sky, calculating. "But it will be hard on the horses, harder on the wounded." "Can they make it?" The young warrior glanced at his injured companions, then nodded slowly. "Apache have ridden further in worse condition. We will make it. The question is what happens when we reach this white town." "We find Martha Whitman," Ayanna said. "She can arrange protection, can coordinate with law enforcement we can trust. From there it's another day's ride to Santa Fe, but on better roads with legitimate authority backing us." They rode through the gathering darkness, a somber procession carrying wounded men and the weight of lives lost. The euphoria of survival was tempered by the cost, by the knowledge that they had killed men, however necessary it might have been. As full night fell and stars emerged in their countless thousands, Bear rode close to Ayanna, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "You fought well today. Lozen told me you moved like someone who understands combat, who's been trained. My mother taught me. Not just tracking and plant knowledge, but how to fight, how to survive. She said a woman needs to know how to protect herself because the world is full of men who see us as prey." Ayanna paused, remembering. "I thought I'd left all that behind when I married Diego, when I tried to become civilized. Today I remembered why she taught me those things. Your mother was wise." They rode in silence for a while, the desert night embracing them with its vast indifference. Finally, Ayanna spoke again, voicing the question that had been growing in her mind. When this is over, when we deliver the evidence and Blackwell faces justice, what happens then? What happens to us? Bear was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. When he did, his voice carried a note of something she couldn't quite identify, something that might have been hope or might have been fear. I suppose that depends on what you want. We married out of necessity to protect you from Blackwell's schemes. But necessity doesn't always make a good foundation for a life together. If you want, once this is done, once you're safe, we could arrange an annulment. You could have your freedom, could rebuild your ranch without a stranger complicating things. And if I don't want that? The question slipped out before Ayanna could consider it surprising her as much as it seemed to surprise him. He turned to look at her, his face barely visible in the starlight, but she could feel the intensity of his gaze. Then I'd say we figure it out together. I've been alone a long time, moving from place to place, keeping promises to dead men. Maybe it's time to make promises to the living, to someone who's here, who's real, who fights like an Apache warrior and has more courage than anyone I've ever met. Warmth spread through Ayanna's chest, surprising in its intensity. She had married this man knowing nothing about him except that he was honorable. Now, after days of danger and revelation, she was beginning to understand what honor looked like when it walked around in a man's skin. "When this is over," she said quietly, "we'll talk, really talk, about what we want, who we are, what kind of life might be possible for a mountain man and an Apache woman rancher who probably have no business trying to build something together. Sounds reasonable. But first we survive. We get this evidence to people who can use it. We stop Blackwell. We prevent a war." "First we survive," Bear agreed. Ahead, one of the scouts had stopped, raising a hand in warning. The column halted, warriors fading into defensive positions with the instinctive speed of people who had learned that survival often depended on reactions measured in heartbeats. Nashota rode back to Bear and Ayanna. "There are riders ahead, coming from the direction of Fort Prescott. Too many to be a normal patrol. Perhaps Blackwell has more men than we thought." Bear's hand went to his rifle. "How many?" "At least 15, maybe 20. The numbers were sobering. Even with surprise and superior tactics, they couldn't hope to fight that many men, not with wounded warriors and tired horses. They were trapped between the ambush site behind them and unknown forces ahead. "We need another way," Ayanna said, her mind racing. "There's an old mission abandoned for years about 2 miles north of the main trail. It's partially collapsed, but the walls are stone defensible. If we can reach it, we can hold out until Martha realizes we're coming and sends help." Nashota considered this. "And if help doesn't come?" "Then we die fighting," Lozen said matter-of-factly. "But at least we die with weapons in our hands, not running like frightened rabbits." It was decided. They turned north, leaving the main trail, following paths that existed more in memory than reality. Behind them, the sound of many horses on the main trail grew louder, then began to fade as the riders continued south, apparently not aware that their quarry had left the obvious route. The mission appeared in the moonlight like a ghost of a more optimistic age, when Spanish priests had thought they could convert the Apache and build permanent settlements in country that had resisted permanent occupation for centuries. 3 walls still stood 30 feet high, surrounding a courtyard overgrown with mesquite and creosote. The roof had collapsed decades ago, but the walls were solid stone thick enough to stop bullets. They led the horses into the courtyard and established defensive positions. The wounded were moved to the most protected area, and Lozen began treating their injuries with a mixture of traditional Apache remedies and practical field medicine learned through hard experience. Bear and Nashota stood on opposite sides of the compound, watching the surrounding terrain. Ayanna joined Bear, her body aching with exhaustion, but her mind too alert to rest. "We can't stay here long," Bear said quietly. "Maybe 12 hours, maybe less, before someone finds us. We need to get a message to Martha, let her know where we are." "I could go," Ayanna offered. "Alone on horseback, I could reach Fort Prescott in a few hours. Find Martha, bring back help." "Too dangerous. Blackwell's men are out there searching. They'd spot you before you got halfway to town." "Then what do we do?" Bear was silent, and in that silence Ayanna heard the sound that would change everything. The distant but distinct crack of a rifle shot, then another coming from the direction of Fort Prescott. Not the sustained fire of a battle, but careful spaced shots, the kind that might be used for signaling. "Someone's calling for help," Bear said, "or warning of danger. Either way, it means something's happening in Fort Prescott, something that might involve Martha." As if in answer, one of the Apache scouts appeared in the courtyard entrance, breathing hard from running. He spoke rapidly to Nashota, who translated for Bear and Ayanna. "The riders we heard earlier, they weren't searching for us. They were riding hard toward Fort Prescott as if summoned, and there's smoke rising from the town, lots of it. Something is burning." Ayanna felt ice in her veins. "Martha, if Blackwell discovered she's a marshal, if he's moving against her—" "Then we're out of time," Bear finished. "And we have to make a choice. Hide here and hope we're not found, or ride into Fort Prescott and try to save whatever can be saved." Around them, the Apache warriors watched, waiting for a decision that would determine whether they lived or died, whether their sacrifice in Apache Pass meant anything, or was just another footnote in the endless story of violence that defined this land. Ayanna looked at Bear, at this mountain man who had kept his promises, who had fought beside her, who might be the only chance they had of getting Diego's evidence to people who could use it. "We ride," she said. "Martha helped Diego. She's risked everything. We don't abandon our own." Bear nodded, something like pride showing in his gray eyes. "We ride." The smoke rising from Fort Prescott painted the dawn sky in shades of amber and ash, a funeral pyre for whatever Blackwell had destroyed in his fury. They rode hard, the Apache warriors spreading out in a defensive formation, wounded men gritting teeth against pain, everyone understanding that they were racing toward danger rather than away from it. As they crested the final ridge overlooking the town, the scope of the destruction became clear. Martha's boarding house. The ridge view was burning flames consuming the two-story structure with voracious appetite. People milled in the streets, some fighting the fire with bucket brigades, others simply watching the building die. Bear pulled his horse to a halt, his jaw tight beneath his beard. "That's not random destruction. That's a message. Blackwell knows Martha was working against him." Nashota brought his warriors together, speaking in rapid Apache. Then he turned to Bear and Ayanna. "My men will not enter the White Town. Too many soldiers, too many guns pointed at Apache. But we stay here, watch. If you need us, signal." He demonstrated a specific bird call, 3 notes rising. "We come fast, we fight hard. But understand, if we fight in White Town, there will be war. No going back." "Understood," Bear said. "And thank you for everything. Your grandfather will hear how bravely you fought, how you honored your promises." Nashota's scarred face showed something that might have been respect. "You fight well for white man. Like mountain cat, smart and fierce. Your woman, too. She remembers Apache ways. This is good." He paused, then added, "If you survive this day, come back to our lands. Chief Mongus will want to hear full story, and perhaps Apache need friends who understand honor." With that, the warriors melted back into the rocks, and scrub becoming invisible despite the growing daylight. Only their watching eyes remained hidden but present, waiting to see what would happen next. Bear and Ayanna rode down into Fort Prescott, slowly, hands visible, making no threatening moves. The town was in chaos, people running between buildings, shouting for water, for help, for order. No one paid much attention to 2 more dusty travelers entering from the east. They found Martha 3 blocks from her burning boarding house, standing in the street covered in soot and blood that might or might not have been her own. Her dress was torn, her gray hair had come loose from its pins, but her eyes were alert, fierce, the eyes of someone who had survived by being smarter and tougher than those who wanted her dead. She saw them approaching, and her expression shifted through surprise, relief, and warning in quick succession. She moved to intercept them before they could dismount, her voice low and urgent. You shouldn't be here. Blackwell's men are everywhere searching for you for the evidence. They hit the boarding house an hour before dawn, tried to take me alive, but I fought my way out through the back. Lost everything. My cover, my network, 5 years of work, all burned to ash. But you're alive, Ayanna said. That's what matters. For now. But Blackwell's already left for Santa Fe. He rode out yesterday with a dozen men and a portfolio he claims contains proof that Marshal Hayes is corrupt, taking bribes from smugglers. It's all fabricated, but he's got forged documents, false witnesses, enough to create doubt. If he gets to the territorial authorities before we do, Hayes will be arrested, and the real evidence will never see the light of day. Bear's hands tightened on his reins. How long before we can organize a proper escort official backing to get us to Santa Fe safely? Days at least, maybe a week. I've sent telegrams to contacts in Tucson and Albuquerque, but marshals are scattered thin across the territory, and by the time they assemble a force, it'll be too late. Then we go now, Ayanna said. Just us. Fast horses, back trails, whatever it takes. Martha shook her head. You won't make it. Blackwell's left men watching every route. He knows you have to come to Santa Fe eventually, and he's prepared. The main stage road is watched. The northern route through the Mesa country is covered. Even the Apache trails, he's got scouts posted. He spent years building this criminal empire, and he's not going to let it fall because of some documents and a determined widow. A woman emerged from the crowd, moving with purpose toward them. She was younger than Martha, perhaps 30, with blonde hair tucked under a practical hat and eyes that assessed everything with the trained attention of someone accustomed to danger. She wore the simple dress of a school teacher, but there was nothing simple about the way she moved. Martha, the woman said, her voice carrying a slight southern accent. I came as soon as I heard. Are you hurt? Nothing that won't heal, Sarah. Martha turned to Bear and Ayanna. This is Lieutenant Sarah Ashford, military intelligence, working undercover as a school teacher. She's been tracking Blackwell's weapons smuggling from the Army side. Sarah, meet Deputy Marshal Bear McAllister and Ayanna Delgado McAllister. Sarah's eyes widened slightly at the names. The widow who married the stranger in the courthouse. The story spread across 3 territories. Some say it was romance. Others say it was desperation. I'm guessing the truth is more complicated. Much more, Bear said dryly. We have Diego Delgado's evidence, complete documentation of Blackwell's entire operation, but we need to get it to Santa Fe before Blackwell can poison the well. Sarah's expression grew focused, tactical. I have resources. A military escort from Fort Union could be here in 12 hours. Heavily armed official sanction, the kind of force that would make Blackwell's men think twice about attacking. 12 hours might as well be 12 days, Ayanna said. Every hour Blackwell has in Santa Fe is another hour he's using to undermine Hayes, to create reasonable doubt, to position himself as the victim rather than the criminal. Then we need a different approach. Sarah's mind was clearly racing, sorting through options, calculating odds. What if we bypass the roads entirely? There's a telegraph office here that connects to Santa Fe. We could transmit the most damning evidence by wire, get it into Hayes's hands immediately. The physical documents could follow with proper escort, but at least we'd have leverage proof that Blackwell can't suppress. Martha nodded slowly. It could work. The telegraph operator Abigail Moore, she's been helping us. Blackwell doesn't know she's part of the network. We could encode the transmission, make it look like ordinary business traffic, but include enough specific details that Hayes would understand what he's seeing. How long to transmit? Bear asked. Depends on how much we send. The full ledgers would take hours, but a summary names, dates, specific crimes that we could do in maybe 30-40 minutes if we work fast. Where's the telegraph office? 2 blocks east. But Blackwell has men watching it just like everywhere else. They'll see you coming. Bear dismounted, his movement decisive. Then we make sure they're looking somewhere else. We need a distraction, something big enough to pull their attention away from the telegraph office. Ayanna felt a plan forming, dangerous but possible. The burned boarding house. If more buildings caught fire, if there was panic, if people thought the whole town might burn. That's asking for chaos, Martha warned. People could get hurt. Property destroyed. People are going to get hurt either way, Ayanna said. If Blackwell wins, if he escapes justice, how many more will die? How many more weapons will flow to renegades? How many more families, Apache and white, both will be destroyed? The older woman studied Ayanna with new respect. You've changed since Diego died. I knew you when you were just a rancher's wife trying to stay invisible, trying not to make waves. Now you're willing to burn down a town to stop a greater evil. Diego's death taught me that staying invisible doesn't keep you safe. It just makes you easy prey. I'm done being prey. Martha glanced at Sarah, who nodded. I can help with the distraction. I have access to the fort's ammunition supplies. A few strategically placed explosions, nothing that would actually hurt anyone but loud and visible enough to create panic. That would pull every man Blackwell has toward the noise. Do it, Bear said. We have maybe a 2-hour window before the sun gets high enough that travel becomes dangerous. If we can get the transmission out, if we can put that evidence into Hayes's hands, then, even if they catch us afterward, it'll be too late. The truth will be out. They split up, each moving to their assigned task with the practiced efficiency of people who understood that hesitation meant death. Sarah headed toward Fort Union to gather her materials. Martha went to contact Abigail at the telegraph office to explain what was needed to prepare for a transmission that might change everything. Bear and Ayanna waited in an alley near the telegraph office, watching the watchers, 2 of Blackwell's men posted across the street trying to look casual but failing their attention, too focused their positions, too deliberate. If this goes wrong, Bear said quietly, if they catch us before we can transmit, promise me you'll run. Take the physical documents and run. Find another way to get them to Hayes. Don't let Diego's sacrifice be for nothing. And leave you. Ayanna shook her head. We made vows, Bear. They might have been spoken out of necessity, but that doesn't make them less binding. I'm not leaving you. He looked at her, really looked at her, and something shifted in his expression. When this started, when you chose me in that courthouse, I thought I was just keeping a promise to a dead man. But somewhere between the cellar and Apache Pass, between Drummond's ambush and your grandfather's camp, it stopped being about Diego and started being about you, about us. Before Ayanna could respond, the first explosion rocked the town. A thunderous boom from the direction of the fort followed seconds later by another and another. Smoke and dust rose in towering columns. People began screaming, running, certain that they were under attack by Apache raiders or Mexican revolutionaries or some other threat their fears could conjure. Blackwell's watchers abandoned their posts, running toward the explosions like moths to flame. The street emptied in seconds, leaving Bear and Ayanna a clear path to the telegraph office. They crossed quickly, pushing through the door into a small room dominated by telegraph equipment and filing cabinets. Abigail Moore, a severe-looking woman in her 50s with steel-gray hair and eyes that missed nothing, was already at her station, fingers hovering over the telegraph key. Martha's outside keeping watch, she said without preamble. You have the documents. Bear produced the ledgers from his saddlebag, spreading them on the desk. The most important information is in the 3rd ledger. Names, dates, crimes. Start with that. If we get interrupted, at least the worst will be transmitted. Abigail's fingers began to dance across the key, translating Diego's careful handwriting into Morse code that flowed across the wires toward Santa Fe. Click, 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 a rhythm, like a mechanical heartbeat, each pulse carrying evidence across miles of empty country. Outside, the chaos continued. More explosions, these sounding farther away, Sarah doing her work with precision. The town bell began ringing, summoning volunteers to fight fires that didn't actually exist, pulling more of Blackwell's men away from their posts. Ayanna watched through the window as Martha stood guard, an older woman with a rifle held with the confidence of someone who had used it before and would again if necessary. The minutes crawled past, each one feeling like an hour, while Abigail's fingers never stopped moving, never hesitated, translating death and corruption into electrical impulses. How much longer? Bear asked after what felt like an eternity. 10 minutes. Maybe 15. I'm sending the worst of it now. The murders, the government officials on his payroll, the weapons shipments to Apache renegades. Abigail paused, glancing up. Did you know there's a senator involved? And a territorial judge? This goes higher than anyone imagined. That's why Blackwell's so desperate to stop it, Ayanna said. It's not just him at risk. It's an entire network of powerful men who've been profiting from violence and misery. A sound from outside made them all freeze. Horses moving fast, multiple riders. The distraction had worked, but only for so long. Now someone was coming, and they were coming with purpose. Martha burst through the door. Blackwell's men, at least 8 of them. They figured out the explosions were a diversion. We have maybe 2 minutes before they arrive. I need 5. Abigail said, her fingers flying faster across the key. The transmission's almost complete, but if I stop now, half of it will be useless fragments. Bear moved to the door, his rifle ready. Then you'll have your 5 minutes, whatever it takes. He stepped outside, and Ayanna followed, refusing to let him face this alone. Martha took up position on the opposite side of the door, creating a crossfire position. Down the street, riders appeared, 8 men as promised, all armed, all wearing expressions of murderous intent. The leader was Garrett Price, Jr., the man who had threatened them in the courthouse, the man whose father had built an empire on stolen lives. He reined his horse to a halt 50 feet away, his hand resting on his revolver. McAllister, Mrs. McAllister, you've caused quite a bit of trouble. My father's very disappointed. He thought you'd be reasonable, thought you'd accept reality, but instead you chose the hard way. That was a mistake. The only mistake, Bear called back, his voice carrying clearly down the empty street, was your father's belief that he was above the law, that money and violence could substitute for justice. That ended today. Price laughed, a sound without humor. Justice. You want to talk about justice? My father built this territory. He brought commerce, prosperity, jobs. He made something from nothing. And you want to destroy it all because of some outdated notion of right and wrong. He armed Apache renegades. Ayanna shouted, her voice cracking with emotion. He deliberately created violence that got innocent people killed, white and Apache both, so he could profit from their fear. That's not building. That's murder. Business, Price corrected. It's just business. People die every day in the territories. That's the cost of progress. Your husband understood that deep down. Why do you think he spent so much time pretending? Because he knew that idealism is for children and fools. Inside, Abigail's telegraph continued its clicking rhythm each second, bringing them closer to completion. Each second that Price and his men stayed talking rather than shooting was a second gained. Diego understood something you'll never grasp, Ayanna said, that some things are worth dying for, that honor and justice aren't just words, they're the only things that separate us from animals. He died believing that, and I won't let his death be meaningless. Price's expression hardened. Touching, but ultimately irrelevant. You're 8 people in a telegraph office. We're 8 armed men with no witnesses. The math is simple. You're going to give us those documents, and then we're going to make sure this never happened. Can't give you what we don't have, Bear said. The documents are gone, already on their way to Santa Fe through channels you can't intercept. Your father's finished Price. The only question now is whether you're smart enough to surrender or stupid enough to die for his crimes. For a moment, Price seemed to waver, doubt flickering across his face. Then his hand moved toward his gun, and the street exploded into violence. Bear fired first, his shot precise, taking Price's horse in the chest rather than the rider. The animal went down, throwing Price, buying precious seconds. Martha's rifle barked twice, and 2 more horses reared their riders, fighting for control. Ayanna had Diego's revolver, the one she'd found in the root cellar, the one he'd never gotten the chance to use. She fired at the nearest rider, not trying for a killing shot, but aiming for his weapon, trying to disarm rather than destroy. The bullet struck his rifle, sending it spinning from his hands. Then return fire came, heavy and sustained bullets, shattering the telegraph office windows, chewing into the wooden walls. Bear pulled Ayana down behind a water trough as the world became noise and terror and the acrid smell of gunpowder. Inside, Abigail kept transmitting her fingers, never faltering despite the chaos, despite bullets passing inches from her head. The woman was made of iron and determination refusing to stop until the last piece of evidence had been sent, until Diego's work was complete. Price was back on his feet now, rage on his face, advancing with his gun drawn. But before he could fire, a new sound cut through the chaos. A bird call, 3 rising notes piercing and clear. The Apache warriors came like shadows given form, materializing from alleys and rooftops where they'd been watching, waiting for the signal. Nashada was first, his rifle speaking with deadly accuracy, followed by Lozin and the others, a force that Blackwell's men had never imagined, never prepared for. The fight turned in seconds. Blackwell's men found themselves outnumbered and outflanked, caught in a perfect killing box with no escape. Some tried to surrender, throwing down their weapons. Others chose to fight and died for that choice. Price was one of the fighters. He got off 3 shots before Nashoda's bullet took him in the chest, spinning him around, dropping him in the dust of a street he'd thought his family owned. As suddenly as it had begun, the violence ended. 8 of Blackwell's men lay dead or wounded in the street. The Apache warriors moved among them, collecting weapons, ensuring no further resistance. Inside the telegraph office, Abigail finally stopped transmitting. She looked up, her face pale but triumphant. It's done. All of it. Every name, every crime, every piece of evidence Diego gathered. It's all in Marshal Hayes's hands now. Martha lowered her rifle, exhaustion written in every line of her face. Then it's over. Blackwell can run, but he can't hide. Not now. Not with Hayes knowing everything. Bear helped Ayana to her feet, checking her for injuries, his hands gentle despite their recent violence. You hurt? No. Scared, exhausted, but not hurt. She looked at the carnage in the street, at the price paid for justice, and felt something settle in her chest. Diego would be proud. We finished what he started. Not quite finished, Bear said. Blackwell's still in Santa Fe, still free, and he still has resources, connections, ways to escape justice if we give him time. We need to ride. Now. Before he learns what happened here and runs. Sarah appeared from around a corner, her schoolteacher dress now covered in dust and soot from the explosion she'd arranged. I can have a military escort ready in an hour. 20 cavalrymen, enough to ride into Santa Fe with authority and arrest Blackwell before he knows we're coming. Do it, Martha said. And send word ahead to Hayes. Tell him we're coming with the witnesses, the physical evidence, everything he needs to make this stick in court. As the sun climbed toward noon, they prepared for the final leg of a journey that had already cost so much. The Apache warriors melted back into the desert, their part in this played their honor satisfied. Nashoda paused before leaving, touching his hand to his heart in the Apache gesture of respect. You fought well, both of you. Chief Mongus will hear of this. And Apache will remember that not all white men are liars, not all soldiers are enemies. Perhaps there is hope for peace after all. Then he was gone, and they were left with the debris of battle, the weight of what they'd done, and the knowledge that one more fight remained before Diego's ghost could finally rest. The road to Santa Fe stretched before them like a promise written in dust and stone, 60 miles of territory that felt different now, transformed by the knowledge that justice was no longer a distant dream, but an approaching reality. The military escort rode in disciplined formation, 20 cavalrymen under the command of a hard-eyed captain who had served on the frontier long enough to recognize genuine evil when he saw its documentation. Bear and Ayana rode near the center of the column, the leather satchel with Diego's evidence secured in a military dispatch case protected by men sworn to uphold the law. Martha traveled with them, as did Sarah, both women having abandoned their covers, their years of undercover work now complete. The landscape changed as they traveled, transitioning from the Red Rock Desert into higher country where juniper and pine grew more densely. The air grew cooler, thinner, carrying scents of sage and distant rain. It was country. Diego would have loved Ayana. thought country he had ridden through countless times, gathering the evidence that would finally bring down the men who killed him. They reached Santa Fe as evening settled over the ancient city, the adobe buildings glowing golden in the last light of day. The capital of the territory sprawled across hills that had seen Spanish conquistadors and Mexican governors, and now American territorial administration, layer upon layer of history, written in mud, brick, and blood. The United States Marshal's office stood near the plaza, a solid two-story building that radiated official authority. As their column approached, Ayanna felt her heart begin to race. This was the moment everything had been building toward, the culmination of Diego's sacrifice, of their desperate flight, of all the violence and loss. A man emerged from the office as they dismounted, and Ayanna recognized him from the photographs in Diego's ledger. Marshal John Hayes, 60 years old, with a gray beard and eyes that had seen too much, but still believed in the possibility of justice. He moved with the careful deliberation of someone carrying the weight of responsibility. But when he saw Martha, his weathered face broke into a smile of genuine relief. "Martha Whitman, when I got your telegram, I barely believed it. 5 years you've been dark, and I was starting to think we'd lost you too." "You nearly did," Martha said, embracing him briefly. "Blackwell burned me out yesterday morning, but not before we got what we needed." She gestured to Bear and Ayanna. "Marshal Hayes, meet Deputy Marshal Ezra McAllister and Ayanna Delgado McAllister. They're the ones who made this possible, who carried Diego's evidence through hell and brought it here." Hayes studied them both with the assessing gaze of a man who had learned to judge character quickly and accurately. "Diego spoke of you, Mrs. McAllister, though he never mentioned you by name, said he had a wife who was stronger than she knew, braver than circumstances had let her show." Looks like he was right. Emotion clogged Ayanna's throat, but she managed to speak. "He was a good man, better than I understood while he lived. I'm just trying to make sure his death meant something." "It will," Hayes promised. "Come inside. We have a lot to discuss and not much time." Blackwell arrived 2 days ago with his forged evidence, his bought witnesses, his whole elaborate construction designed to paint me as the criminal. He's been busy spreading poison, but your telegram gave me advance warning. Let me start building a defense. Now, with the physical evidence, with living witnesses, we can bury him. Inside the marshal's office was organized chaos. Deputies moved between desks covered with documents, preparing the case that would bring down Morgan Blackwell and his network of corruption. Hayes led them to a back room where they could speak privately, closing the door against the bustle outside. Bear placed the dispatch case on the table and opened it, revealing the ledgers that had already caused so much death. Hayes reached for them with hands that trembled slightly, not from age, but from the recognition of what they represented. "My God," he breathed, paging through the first ledger. "This is more comprehensive than anything we dared hope for. Diego must have spent years compiling this, risking his life every day." He looked up at Ayanna. "Did you know about his work?" "No. He kept me ignorant to protect me. I was angry about that for a long time, but I understand now. If Blackwell had suspected I knew anything, I would have been dead months ago, and this evidence would have died with me." Hayes nodded, returning his attention to the documents. As he read, his expression cycled through shock, anger, and grim satisfaction. 500 Winchester rifles to Apache renegades, 15 government officials on the payroll, 12 murders documented with dates and methods. And here the weapons shipment routes, the smuggling corridors, everything we need to roll up the entire operation from Mexico to Colorado. "There's more," Martha said. "The telegraph transmission included information about Blackwell's plans for the next 3 months. He's been preparing to expand into New Mexico territory, buying influence with territorial legislators, positioning himself to control mining contracts worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. This isn't just about punishing past crimes, it's about preventing future ones." A knock at the door interrupted them. A young deputy entered, his face flushed with excitement. "Marshal Judge Cornelius Harding just arrived from Fort Prescott, says he has urgent information about the Blackwell case." Ayanna felt Bear tense beside her. Judge Harding, the man who had forced her to choose a husband in open court, who had seemed to be another corrupt official in Blackwell's pocket. What was he doing here? "Send him in," Hayes said. The judge entered, and Ayanna was struck by how different he looked outside the courtroom. The stern, judgmental demeanor was gone, replaced by something warmer, more human. He saw Ayanna and Bear and smiled a genuine expression that transformed his face. "Mrs. McAllister, Mr. McAllister, I'm glad to see you made it here safely. When I heard about the attack on Martha's boarding house, I feared the worst." "You know Martha?" Ayanna asked, confused. Harding reached into his coat and pulled out a badge similar to the one Bear carried, Deputy United States Marshal. "I've been working with her for 3 years, maintaining a cover as a corrupt judge on Blackwell's payroll. The marriage arrangement I forced on you in the courthouse that was designed to give Bear legal authority to protect you and investigate your ranch. I apologize for the deception and the humiliation, but it was the only way we could see to keep you alive long enough to find Diego's evidence." The revelation hit Ayanna like a physical blow. The entire courthouse scene, the degrading spectacle of choosing a husband like livestock at auction. It had all been theater, a carefully constructed operation to protect her. The anger she'd been carrying, the sense of violation, it suddenly had nowhere to go. "You could have told me," she said, her voice tight. "You could have trusted me with the truth." "Could we?" Harding's voice was gentle but firm. "You're an honest woman, Mrs. McAllister. That's a virtue, but it makes you a terrible liar. If you'd known the whole plan, if you'd been play-acting rather than genuinely choosing Blackwell's watchers would have noticed. They would have seen through the deception, and both you and Bear would have been dead within days. Sometimes the best way to protect someone is to keep them ignorant of the protection." It made sense, Ayanna realized, even as she hated it. The entire operation had depended on authenticity, on her genuine desperation and Bear's genuine response. If it had been scripted, it would have failed. "What happens now?" Bear asked, steering the conversation toward practical matters. "Blackwell's here in Santa Fe. He has lawyers, he has money, he still has connections we probably don't know about. Evidence is one thing, but making it stick in court is another." Hayes stood, his decision made. "We arrest him. Tonight. Public arrest in front of witnesses, charges read aloud where everyone can hear them. We take away his ability to operate in shadows, expose him to the light, and let the law do what it was designed to do." "He'll fight," Martha warned. "Men like Blackwell don't go quietly. He'll have guards hired, guns, people willing to die to keep him free." "Then we bring overwhelming force," Hayes said. 20 marshals, the cavalry escort that brought you here, and we do it in the plaza where the whole city can watch. This is about more than just arresting one criminal. It's about showing that the law applies to everyone, that money and influence can't substitute for justice." As night fell over Santa Fe, they prepared for the confrontation. Marshals checked weapons and reviewed plans. The cavalry captain positioned his men at strategic points around the plaza. Word spread through the city that something significant was happening, and people began to gather, drawn by the promise of spectacle, of witnessing history being made. Blackwell was staying at the finest hotel in Santa Fe, a 3-story establishment that catered to wealthy travelers and territorial politicians. Hayes led the way, Bear and Ayanna flanking him, Martha and Sarah behind, all of them armed, all of them ready for whatever resistance they might face. They found Blackwell in the hotel's dining room, holding court with a group of well-dressed men, territorial officials, and wealthy merchants who formed the elite of Santa Fe society. He saw them approaching, and his face went through a remarkable transformation, shock and fear quickly masked by artificial confidence. "Marshal Hayes," he said loudly, playing to the room, "I'm surprised to see you here. I would have thought you'd be in custody by now, given the evidence of your corruption that I've provided to the territorial governor." Hayes pulled the warrant from his jacket, his voice carrying clearly through the now silent dining room. "Morgan Blackwell, you are under arrest for conspiracy, murder weapons, smuggling, bribery of government officials, and treason against the United States. You will come with us peacefully, or you will be taken by force. The choice is yours." Blackwell's hired guards, 4 hard-looking men positioned around the room, moved toward their weapons. But the cavalry soldiers were already there, rifles trained faces showing they would not hesitate to fire if necessary. "This is outrageous," Blackwell blustered, but his voice lacked conviction. "I'm a legitimate businessman, a pillar of this community. These are trumped-up charges brought by corrupt officials trying to protect their own criminal enterprise." "We have your ledgers," Ayanna said, stepping forward, her voice ringing clear. "Diego's documentation of every crime you committed, every rifle you smuggled, every official you bribed, every person you murdered. It's all there in your own handwriting and records you never imagined would see daylight. You're finished, Blackwell. Your empire is over." Something died in Blackwell's eyes as the reality penetrated. He sagged slightly, the confidence that had carried him through decades of criminal success finally cracking. "That damned Mexican. I knew he was too curious, asked too many questions. Should have killed him sooner." "But you didn't," Bear said. "And he got the evidence. He died for it, but he got it. And now it's going to send you to the gallows." They led Blackwell out in chains through a plaza packed with hundreds of witnesses, all watching as one of the territory's most powerful men was reduced to a prisoner shuffling between armed guards. Some in the crowd cheered. Others stood in shocked silence, unable to reconcile the respected businessman they knew with the monster described in the charges. The trial took place 3 weeks later, conducted in the largest courtroom Santa Fe could provide to accommodate the crowds desperate to witness justice being done. Ayanna testified, her voice steady, as she described finding Diego's evidence as she read from the ledgers documenting Blackwell's crimes. Martha testified about her years undercover, about the network of corruption Blackwell had built. Sarah provided military documentation of the weapons that had ended up in Apache hands. The defense tried every trick, every legal maneuver, but the evidence was overwhelming, undeniable. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning with guilty verdicts on all counts. Judge Harding, presiding with the same stern demeanor he'd shown in Fort Prescott, but now in service of actual justice, pronounced the sentence. "Morgan Blackwell, you have been found guilty of crimes that strike at the heart of civilized society. You armed enemies of the United States, you corrupted the institutions meant to protect citizens, you murdered good men who stood in your way. The sentence of this court is death by hanging, to be carried out 1 week from today." Blackwell was led away, and as he passed Ayanna, he looked at her with something that might have been respect mixed with hatred. "You were just supposed to be a widow, a victim. Nobody special. How did you become this?" "Diego taught me," she said quietly. "He showed me that ordinary people can stand against evil. That courage isn't about being unafraid, it's about doing what's right even when you're terrified. You killed a good man, but you couldn't kill what he believed in, what he fought for. That's why you lost." 2 months later, Ayanna stood on the ridge overlooking her ranch, watching the sun paint the desert in shades of copper and gold. The buildings had been repaired, the damage from Drummond's search erased. The land looked peaceful, almost innocent, giving no sign of the violence it had witnessed, the secrets it had held. Bear walked up behind her, his footsteps quiet, but not silent. He'd stopped trying to move silently around her weeks ago after she'd demonstrated that her Apache training meant she always heard him anyway. "The last of the repairs are finished," he said. "The barn's solid, the fences are mended, and I reinforced the root cellar walls, properly this time. No more hidden compartments." "Good." Ayanna leaned back against him, accepting the comfort of his solid presence. "What about the offer from Marshal Hayes? The position as lead investigator for territorial corruption cases?" "I told him I needed to discuss it with my wife first. It would mean travel time away from the ranch danger, not the quiet life you might have hoped for when you married Diego." Ayanna turned to face him, her hand coming up to touch his bearded face. "I never wanted a quiet life. I wanted a meaningful one. Diego understood that, even if he couldn't share the truth with me. He was fighting for something larger than himself, something worth the risk." "The offer from Hayes. It's a chance to continue that fight to prevent other widows from standing where I stood wondering why their husbands had to die. You'd be okay with me gone for weeks at a time?" "I'd hate it," she admitted. "But I'd understand it. And besides, who says I'd be here alone?" Hayes made me an offer too. Consultant on Apache relations, someone who can bridge the gap between the territorial government and my grandfather's people, who can help prevent the kind of violence Blackwell was engineering. Bear smiled, the expression transforming his stern face into something warmer. "So we'd both be gone working cases that matter, coming home to each other when we can. Not exactly a traditional marriage. When have we ever been traditional? We met because a corrupt judge forced me to choose a husband. We fell in love while running for our lives. We got married before we even knew each other's full names." She laughed, the sound carrying across the desert evening. "Traditional went out the window the moment I pointed at a silent stranger in the corner of a courtroom." "Do you regret it?" "Any of it." Ayanna considered the question seriously. "I regret that Diego had to die. I regret every life lost to Blackwell's greed. I regret the violence and the fear and the pain, but choosing you, trusting you, building this strange, complicated, utterly imperfect life with you, no, I don't regret that at all." He kissed her then properly, the kind of kiss that had been building for months through danger and revelation and the slow recognition that what had started as necessity had transformed into something deeper, something real. When they finally separated, Ayanna rested her forehead against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "Diego left me a letter. Martha found it in his effects, sealed, marked to be delivered only if he died. I read it this morning." "What did it say?" "That he was sorry for the secrets, sorry for the danger he brought into my life, but that he didn't regret the work, didn't regret fighting for justice, even knowing it might cost him everything." She paused, emotion tightening her throat. "And he said if he didn't make it back, if Bear came looking for me, I should trust him. That Bear was a good man who kept his promises, who understood honor in a way most men had forgotten. He said if I gave you a chance, you might surprise me." "Did I?" "Every single day." She pulled back to look up at him. "He knew somehow. Knew that you and I would work, that we'd fit together despite everything that said we shouldn't. One last gift from a man who loved me enough to plan for a future he knew he wouldn't be part of." A rider appeared in the distance, approaching the ranch at a steady pace. As they drew closer, Ayanna recognized Martha, her gray hair gleaming in the sunset light. The older woman dismounted, her expression carrying news. "Mail from Marshal Hayes," she said, handing Bear an official envelope. "And a personal message. He wants you both in Denver next month. There's a case brewing, something about land fraud and railroad corruption. He thinks you're the right people to handle it." Bear opened the envelope, scanning the contents. 3 months, maybe 4. Undercover work, high risk, but a chance to stop some very bad people from stealing from homesteaders and small ranchers. "People like me," Ayanna said. "Like I was before all this. People just trying to build something to make a life, who get crushed by rich men who see them as obstacles to profit." "Exactly like you," Martha confirmed. "Which is why Hayes wants you specifically. You understand what's at stake in a way someone who's always been powerful never could. And Bear, well, he's proven he can operate in the shadows, can get close to dangerous men and survive long enough to bring them down." Ayanna looked at Bear, saw the question in his eyes. This was the moment of decision, the fork in the road where they chose what kind of life they would build together. Safe and quiet, rebuilding the ranch and pretending the last months had never happened, or dangerous and meaningful. Continuing the fight, Diego had started making sure his sacrifice continued to matter. "We'll do it," she said. "Both of us. Together." Martha smiled, pride evident on her weathered face. "Diego would be so damn proud of you. Both of you. You've taken everything he worked for and made it bigger, made it matter more. That's the best memorial anyone could ask for." As Martha rode away, Ayanna and Bear stood together watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. The same stars that had guided them through the desert, that had watched over their desperate flight, that had witnessed their transformation from strangers, forced together by circumstance into partners bound by choice and love. "One more thing," Bear said quietly. "I got word from Chief Mongus. He wants us to visit to spend time with your mother's people. Says you've been gone too long, that it's time you remembered where you come from. And he wants to meet the White Mountain man who married his granddaughter and kept her alive through impossible odds. You want to spend time in an Apache camp? You, a federal marshal surrounded by warriors who have every reason to distrust white authority. I want to spend time with your family learning about the culture that made you who you are. The rest will work itself out. Besides," he grinned, "Nashota told me I fight like a mountain cat. That's got to count for something." They went inside as full darkness settled over the ranch lighting lamps against the night, preparing a simple meal, doing the ordinary things that made up a life. But they were different now. Both of them changed by what they'd survived, by what they'd chosen, by the recognition that love could grow in the strangest soil, could thrive even in the shadow of death and danger. Later, lying in bed with Bear's arm around her, Ayanna spoke into the darkness. "Thank you for keeping your promise to Diego, for protecting me, for seeing me not as a victim to be saved, but as a partner worth trusting." "Thank you," Bear replied, "for choosing me that day in the courthouse, for trusting a stranger when every rational part of you probably said to choose someone familiar, someone safe, for being brave enough to build something new rather than settling for something comfortable." Outside, a coyote called to the night, its voice carrying across the desert, wild and free and utterly alive. Inside, two people who had found each other through tragedy and necessity held close understanding that the best love stories were never simple, never easy, but always, always worth fighting for. The ranch would wait for their return. The cases would come and go. Justice would be served, sometimes perfectly, sometimes imperfectly, but always with intention, always with purpose. And through it all, they would have each other partners in every sense of the word, building a life that honored the past while embracing the uncertain promise of the future. In Santa Fe, Morgan Blackwell died at the end of a rope. His empire dismantled, his crimes exposed, his name forever linked with corruption and evil. 15 government officials faced justice. The flow of illegal weapons stopped. The violence Blackwell had engineered for profit began to ebb. And on a small ranch in Arizona Territory, in a house that had once held secrets and lies, but now held only truth and hope, Ayanna Delgado McAllister and Ezra Bear. McAllister slept peacefully, dreaming of justice and love and all the adventures that lay ahead, knowing that whatever came, they would face it together. The story that began with a forced choice in a desperate courtroom ended with a chosen partnership built on respect, trust, and the understanding that sometimes the best things in life come from the most unexpected places. Diego's sacrifice had not been in vain. His evidence had changed the territory, and his widow, the woman he had loved and protected even in death, had become something he would have admired beyond measure. A warrior for justice, a keeper of promises, a woman who chose her own destiny and never looked back. The end of one story, the beginning of another. And in the desert night under stars that had witnessed countless endings and beginnings, life continued complex and beautiful and worth every struggle, every sacrifice, every moment of courage in the face of impossible odds.